Welcome to the Women Influencers in Business and CRE podcast. I am Veronica Malolos, CCIM, founder and CEO of Capital Stack Real Estate Group, a commercial real estate company serving the greater Orlando area. Today's guest is Tiffany English, Senior Director, Architecture for Qualcomm, the world's leading technology innovator. We spoke about her youth in Vietnam during the fall of Saigon, living all over the world, and eventually building a career in architectural interior design in commercial real estate. You will definitely be inspired by her story. Please don't forget to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe below. I welcome your comments, and please share with someone who can benefit from this podcast. Good morning, Tiffany. How are you today?
I'm great, Veronica. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, no, thank you. I do know that you are in Pacific time. Would that be California?
It is. I'm in San Diego, and I've been in California my entire career.
Oh, how wonderful. I love California. San Diego is a beautiful city. So I welcome you to our podcast. And what I'd like to do, Tiffany, if you don't mind, is I want to start with your story. Tell us about how you grew up in your environment and how you got to where you are today.
Great. Well, I'll try not to make it too long of a story, but I was actually going to touch a little bit on, way back when I started. So I'm going to start with, where I was born and how I was raised, because I think it's very integral to, how I, made my way into this career and what part of my growing up was contributed to the success of that. So I was actually born in Saigon, Vietnam in 1973. My parents, both who work for the U.S. State Department, my dad had been in Vietnam for a while, met my mom there. So my dad is actually from Kansas. And then my mom is Chinese, but grew up in Vietnam. So they met during the Vietnam War. And basically started a family in Vietnam, and my sister and I were both born there. So I am what a lot of people call a third culture kid. There is actually a big group of us all around the world. And what that means is we're children who are Americans who've grown up in other cultures. So from Vietnam, we actually left Vietnam and basically from then moved all around the world. So I grew up most of my childhood in Africa, all over, Mauritania, the Gambia, and Swaziland. And then from there in my preteens or teen years lived in Japan, actually met my husband there. We went to the American school together and in seventh and eighth grade. And then from there, I actually finished high school in New Delhi, India. So I was lucky enough to have that diverse, rounded perspective that growing up in multiple different cultures. But, what's interesting is that when I was growing up at that time, I didn't always appreciate, I think, the what I was learning and the benefit of growing up in different cultures. But what I think what it did for me was it created this ability for me to remain continually curious, to really desire and have a need to understand people's stories, and to build, learn to build relationships, right? So learning to connect with lots of different people with lots of different perspectives and really understanding how that contributes to, innovation and creativity. And so from there, I remember my parents pushing me because I really wanted to stay and go to college in India. So they really pushed me to venture out, needed to go and live in the United States because I really hadn't lived here besides maybe a few months at a time in between posts. So I remember them saying, you really should go to the States. So I chose to come to go to college here in California. And initially I started at San Diego State, and I actually started with a major in photography and a minor in journalism, which, for me, my big dream was to work for National Geographic so I could continue that lifestyle of moving around the world, and documenting that and sharing that with other people. So that was really kind of what my dream was at that point. But I think when I got to college, I all of a sudden, like many people, was exposed to a lot of different things, right? So I started looking into well, I knew I wanted to be on the creative side. So I started looking into, graphic design and environmental design and interior design, and actually chose the path of going to interior design. And initially started that way, and then moved into kind of the architectural interior design world, focused in commercial real estate. So as I started that part of my career, um, you know, it was I loved it. I loved it. I enjoyed, working with clients and having something new and learning their stories and what their businesses did, and all again part of, just what I grew up with, right? That desire to be continually curious and to learn. So one of the things that I'm going to add a little lesson in here as well is one thing that I learned early on in my career, was to raise my hand, right? So whenever people would say, "Oh, there's this project and nobody wants to work on it. It's really technical." And I remember I just told myself, "Raise your hand," right? I was like, "I'll do it. I don't know anything about it, but I'll learn it." And I remember that was one way that really helped me learn so much about so many different things that I think I just never really thought that I knew. I didn't know about. I designed anechoic chambers and, things that maybe some people didn't think were so fun. But what it did was it added more layers of knowledge onto what I had already learned, and allowed me to expand my thought process and my creativity. And to this day, I always tell people, raise your hand. If it seems like something hard, and I think I mentioned this to you before, if it makes you nervous or scares you, probably need to try it because you're going to learn something new. It means you have a fear of the unknown. So there's something for you to learn there. So really that has always been a driving force for me. And so I worked at Ware Malcolm Architects for over 20 years, which I immensely enjoyed. I learned so much. The company was so supportive through my career development, and always putting a lot into making sure that I was continually growing, and I wouldn't have traded that in for anything. Until a client of mine, Qualcomm Technologies, which for many people who don't know what Qualcomm is or who they are, they're much more integral into your life than you think. The whole reason you're able to search the internet on your cell phone is because of Qualcomm. We invented that CNMA technology that allows people to search the internet. Otherwise, we used to just have our flip phones and you would use our phones for just regular phone calls. So Qualcomm was a client of mine when I was at Ware Malcolm for over 15 years. And just right after COVID, they came to me and, thought that I should, try to come on board. The person that was in my position before was retiring. So I was actually didn't think that I would make that move because I was, principal at Ware Malcolm. And what it came down to is this self-awareness. I actually started looking at where I was, turning 50, and where was I in my career, and what have I learned recently. What I had decided was it was time for me to try something new for myself, to challenge myself to do something different. And also I had been mentoring and coaching so many young leaders in my office at Ware Malcolm. And I thought it would be a great way for me to step aside and let them shine and grow and let me go on and learn something different, because it was their turn to lead. So I really looked at it that way and saw it as an opportunity, not only for myself, but for my team members at the time, and decided to make that switch to Qualcomm. And, now I'm part of their global real estate and facilities group at Qualcomm. My role is global. I oversee the whole globe. I have, over 15 million square feet of real estate and in over 30 countries. And I enjoy it so much. So it's kind of that's led me to this path to where I'm at today.
Wow, that's an amazing story, especially because you were actually born in Saigon. And I am just always so curious about wonderful stories like that. It must have been difficult. I mean, your family, you're Americans, and so you were probably helicoptered out of Saigon during the fall of Saigon. Is that correct?
It is actually, we left in April of 75. And my dad put my sister, and I on a military plane. I think they strapped us to the floor actually because it wasn't a
Wow.
passenger plane. And we left and actually headed to the Philippines. And I think we stopped in Hawaii and on our way to the States to be with my grandparents. My dad stayed in Vietnam for a little while after that. Um, and then left. We really left with, one suitcase. Actually, my parents still have that suitcase. My dad, the story goes, he actually wrote my grandparents' address on the front of the suitcase and asked somebody to get it to my grandparents' home. And that's really all we
Wow.
left with. And my parents loved Vietnam. Often say that if the war had turned out differently, they probably would have stayed, and I would have grown up in Vietnam, which I always think is, an interesting idea and an alternate universe, maybe. So I think that it's my parents have always instilled in us that we just keep going. We'll always make things work as long as
Right.
you stay together. So yeah, it was an interesting times. Obviously I was very young, so I don't remember everything, but it's funny, every once in a while I remember smells and certain things, and my parents telling us these stories. So it's
Oh,
which is great. Mm-hmm.
that's really something so unique. I mean, many Americans have never experienced anything like you've experienced. And so I'm always so appreciative whenever I hear somebody's story like yours. And speaking of challenges, I mean, you've been through so much. And I'm sure that just like every woman who is possibly listening out there, and every man, very possibly, have some sort of challenge that they overcame. So you want to talk a little bit about maybe one particular challenge that comes to mind, and how you overcame that?
Well, yeah, and it's funny because when you and I talked before, I mentioned there's quite a few challenges I could talk about, because I'm sure we all have multiple challenges over the course of our lives and careers, and so I think I'm going to talk about one I think that had was one of the most impactful challenges, but also for me one of the most impactful learning experiences, in the course of my career and my life, right? So, there was a time just I think it was in the early 2000s. I had relocated to Sacramento for my company. At the time, we were opening an office up there, and I had two children under the age of 5. I think they were actually under the age of 4. My husband was commuting to San Francisco, so we had a lot going on in our lives. Just juggling kids, opening that office. My husband also, having a long commute. And at that time, and in the place I was in my career, and I know we all evolve as we go through our careers, I was probably, close to 10, maybe 8 years into my career at that time. And there was a place, I think, in my head and my heart that, I felt like this need to do it all by myself, because it would be the only way that I'd ever be validated for all the work that I do. And I think a lot of women go through this, right? Like, you think, I have to do it all myself. I can't ask for help because then it'll be seen as a weakness, right? And I won't be recognized for. So really, I think there was this moment, and this is where commercial real estate women also came into my life, and a lot of crew women, if anyone listens to this, they know this story because I've talked about it before. Is that there was a member of crew that actually lifted their hand out to me and said, you don't have to do this all alone. There's other people who live this life and know what it's like and have shared experience with you. And I remember I took the opportunity to be confidently vulnerable, right? Which I think there was always a fear about being vulnerable, or, showing that you needed help. So I took that moment to take her hand and all of crew, and it really introduced me to, one, that there is a network of people out there. Whether for me it's crew, and I always think you should always find your number one network, and then there you can network in all the other locations too, and all the other organizations. But I really think that having a network of a shared experience really made me realize I don't have to do it alone.
Wow.
And being able to ask for help. And I think those are two key things that I learned during that time, with crew's help and the women in crew, and men, because there's men that belong to crew as well,
Sure.
having sponsors and allies. So, that was a really key moment for me to realize
And,
that. it just freed me in many ways.
Sure. And speaking of crew, I'm sure that you had exercised quite a bit of influence as well. And oftentimes we as leaders don't really think about this, but in as much as we are benefiting from our network, we are also giving. So, talk a little bit about some kind of influence or the one thing that comes to mind as far as how you've influenced either your environment, culture of an organization, or even just, just maybe a person. So, I'd be curious to find out about that.
Yeah, and there's I think throughout my life and my career, there's been certain people that come along and obviously I'm super grateful for my parents for what they've taught me over, the course of my life, and my husband for his partnership and support, which is key. I think that's, having a partner or some, a good, home base or family base is important as well. But there's the women in crew that I've met over the years, and for me, being a part of crew is about giving back, right? So all the help that I received early on in my career, I am trying to give back in, tenfold as much as I can. But there's been people like Wendy Mann, who is the CEO of Crew Network. I am eternally grateful for her for instilling confidence in me when I joined the board at Crew, and just her encouragement to continually grow, right? And that aligned with my values already, right? Staying curious. And then, I think in my business, when I was at Ware Malcolm, I was lucky enough to have a sponsor, at a higher level, his name was actually Matt Brady, and he was the VP. And now I think he's an executive level as well. And I still stay in contact with him, but having a sponsor along the way that was supportive and helping me learn and grow within my career. So I think those influences, again, all come about by asking for that connection, right? Asking for that help, making that connection, building those trusted relationships, which is very important. And then listening and learning, and then taking that and leading, right? I think we, as you and I talked about this collaboration in, connecting with other people, you have a stronger network, you're much more likely to be successful, because it's okay to go to somebody. Like, I know I can call a crew member and say, can you explain this to me? I was in this meeting and I don't know what this means, right? So you have that ability to be vulnerable, but, learn to build confidence and build strong
Sure.
relationships.
Right. But was there one particular thing or program that you had an influence on others? And it's awesome how others have influenced you to be able to give back. But does something come to mind, perhaps, that you have been able to make an impact on yourself?
Yeah, I think, just there's been, with the if self-awareness is a huge part. And I actually went through executive coaching as well, which I, think was an amazing part of my career development. But, self-awareness is one of those things that I think we, I think people sometimes have a hard time facing who they are, right? And I think learning
Sure.
your strengths and weaknesses is a really important part of growth. So that kind of, influences how you grow in your career. So I think being self-aware and getting to know who you are, and being able to continue to work on those things as you evolve in your career is very important. And for me, it's as I mentioned before too, it's if it makes you nervous or uncomfortable, you definitely want to give it a try, because it means you got something to learn.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's part of that.
Awesome. Awesome. And so if you can sum up maybe one piece of advice, right, that you could give to our listeners today, what would that be?
There's lots of advice, but I think I'll use this. Actually, I will use a quote that I love from John Kabat-Zinn. And I know some people have heard me say this before, but I fully and 100% embrace, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And what I mean by that is that life and career and everything will continue to, you can't plan it all the time to be perfect. So what you can do though is you can learn to be flexible and agile and, vulnerable and all those things, and learn to ride the waves, So I think, and part of, doing that is just always being continually curious and seeking out the knowledge that you need to be the best version of yourself.
Wow, I love that. I love that, Tiffany. So we've actually come to the part of the podcast where you get to ask me a question. And so I'm looking forward to it. So please go ahead.
All right, Veronica, I was going to ask you, similar to to what I've been talking about, what have you learned about yourself through the course of your career, and something that you continually, are always working on, right? And trying to make sure that you embrace and as part of your values and your priorities.
Sure. And thanks for the question. I really just pondered on that. And the answer would be that I realized that most barriers are often self-imagined.
Oh,
a lot of times we think to ourselves, no, I can't do that. Or I could never penetrate that circle, or I could never get that client. The word never should never exist in your mindset.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, because oftentimes I think, even as women, we imagine certain things. And so, like what you've covered through the interview, you've talked about working harder because we want to prove ourselves. But oftentimes, those barriers could just be self-imagined. And so that's what I learned early in my career, that I need to be bold. I need to ask for help. And all the things that you've talked about, Tiffany, I totally 100% agree with you. Because as young people, and hopefully we have some young listeners that are tuning in, that they would really realize very early on in their lives and in their careers that you just need to convince yourself that it's okay to be different. It's okay to ask for help, because most people do want to give their assistance to you. Most people do, especially here in the United States. I say that because I'm an immigrant. You're not an immigrant because you're an American citizen. You were born of an American father, even though you lived in Vietnam. But myself, I'm an immigrant, and so it is hard to rebuild a network every time you move and you start questioning yourself all the time. So yes, it is important for us not to imagine some of the barriers. They exist, but oftentimes we stop ourselves because we convince ourselves that they're impenetrable. So that's my answer to that question. And let me tell you, Tiffany, this was such a delight. I appreciate you so much for telling your story. I think everyone has a different and unique story, and certainly yours has been. So do you have some parting words for our audience before we say goodbye?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Veronica, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I think my parting words are: enjoy the journey and the process, and make sure you're learning about yourself and everyone in the world around you along the way. And then that will make it just, your intentions behind everything you do will just be so much more positive. So I encourage everyone to go out there and raise their hand and break down those barriers, and don't be your own barrier. So,
yes.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate it. And thank you to all those who might be listening.
Yes, and thank you, Tiffany. I really appreciate you gracing our podcast today. I think you're a fabulous lady. Congratulations on all your success. And I'm sure there's going to be more in store for you. So you serve as an inspiration. So for that, we are grateful.
Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you.